Moving in with his wizard uncle, a boy begins to study occult magic and accidentally revives a powerful dark wizard. Today we're going to recap the story of the 2018 movie, The House with a Clock in the Walls. After losing his parents, a boy called Louis receives a letter and a bus ticket from his uncle John, inviting him to live with him. After a long journey, the boy arrives in the new town where he is greeted by his uncle who takes him to his car. Halfway there, a church clock strikes 7 o'clock in the evening and the bell tolls 7 times, which for some reason makes John visibly worried. Trying to act normally, the man puts his nephew in the car and drives him to his mansion, which looks like it's straight out of a horror movie. After a brief conversation with the neighbor, the two enter the house and Louis is impressed by the number of clocks his uncle has on the wall. Suddenly, a woman comes out of a cuckoo and introduces herself as Florence, John's friend and neighbor. After the presentation, the woman says she's going to bake some cookies for Louis and the two of them go upstairs to their room while they wait. In the room, John sees that his nephew has a toy in the shape of a snooker ball and tells him that he shouldn't throw it away, but Louis replies that it was the last present he received from his parents and starts to cry. Seeing how upset his nephew was, John returns the toy and starts a magic act with handkerchiefs to cheer up his nephew, but it doesn't work and he lets the boy go to sleep. During the night, Louis wakes up to some strange knocks and notices someone walking outside his room. Curious, the boy goes outside to see what's going on and realizes that something is banging on the inside of the wall, and that his uncle is looking for the source of the noise. While watching, Louis is startled by the cuckoo clock and runs back to his room, only to be noticed by John. The next morning, the boy gets up to find his uncle arguing with Florence about whether or not to enter the wall. As soon as he notices the boy's presence, John just tells him not to be late for his first day at school and closes the door, then goes back to arguing with Florence. Even though he finds everything very strange, the boy obeys his uncle and goes to school, but because he is the new student, Louis is isolated and is hardly chosen to play basketball, but a boy called Tarby manages to convince the others to call the new boy to take part. Even so, Louis is completely terrible and has a dismal basketball performance, sinking the team. After the match, Louis is walking through the corridors when Tarby appears asking for his vote to be class representative. After that, Louis goes to the park and sees Tarby taking batting practice alone. As soon as he notices him, the boy invites the freshman to play and that's what they do. While Tarby asks a little more about where Louis lives. When he hears the answer, Tarby tells him that he lives in the slaughterhouse and reveals that an old man perished there, making the place haunted ever since. Confused, Louis says he didn't see anything wrong until he remembers his uncle wandering the corridors in the middle of the night. Finding this suspicious, Tarby says that he was probably looking for an axe to chop off Louis' arm, which scares the hell out of the boy. At home, he starts looking at a photo of his parents when his mother magically appears and starts talking to him. Talking about his uncle, Louis says that the house is scary and that he thinks Uncle John is hiding something. The woman then reveals that Louis is in danger and tells him that to save himself, he must get the book and the key. But before she can give him any more information, the clock chimes and the boy wakes up, revealing that it was all just a dream. Even though he was scared, Louis plucked up the courage to leave his room and began to follow his uncle until he arrived in a room full of dolls. While following the trail, Louis sees John smashing the wall with an axe and flees in despair, thinking that his uncle is a maniac. In the bedroom, the boy picks up his suitcase and runs towards the staircase where he notices that the stained glass window is moving, forming the phrase, "Don't go." While Louis is trying to figure out what's going on, a walking armor appears behind him and the boy manages to knock it down with his suitcase. On the second floor, Louis sees that all the clocks are spinning wildly and tries to run for the door, but the armchair gets in front of him and starts blocking the way. Desperate, the boy climbs over the upholstery and starts banging on the door when John appears behind him. Frightened, Louis asks if the place is haunted and John replies that the house just liked him. So that his nephew can understand, John reveals that he is a wizard and that the manor has a life of its own, showing his study room and various other magical artifacts. After the revelation, Louis asks why his uncle keeps wandering the corridors and mentions the clock sounds he hears from inside the wall. John then explains that the house belonged to another wizard called Isaac and his wife Selena, and that they left a magic clock inside the walls, hence the chimes. Even though he thinks his uncle is hiding something, Louis decides to go ahead and asks if people are born wizards, but John replies that no, anyone can learn magic. Encouraged by the answer, Louis asks his uncle to teach him and John accepts, taking some old, dusty books for him to start reading. After days, the boy manages to read everything and John decides to go to the next step, introducing a little more of the magic he has around the house. While on their tour, the two pass a cupboard full of spells and padlocks and Louis asks what's inside, but his uncle refuses to answer, saying that the only rule in the house is not to open the cupboard under any circumstances. After the warning, John starts reading a book with some of Isaac's deeds and remembers his last moments with him, revealing that the two were very close friends. That is until Isaac went mad and became a dark wizard, locking himself inside the house to perform a dark magic ritual with the clock. While his uncle relives his memories, Lewis goes to school where he spends the day talking to Tarby. When it's time to leave, John appears in front of the school and calls his nephew, saying that they need to buy some supplies before the full moon. After filling up, they go home and try to start the practical lessons, but Lewis can't do anything magical and John asks him to touch the astronomical clock in the center of the garden. As soon as the boy does this, a miniature version of space magically appears and begins to float around them, which leaves Lewis very impressed. After the show, the young man continues practicing with John and manages to make some progress, but things always go wrong somehow and he ends up making his uncle levitate. In the class to control energy, Lewis even manages to manipulate electricity for a while, but when he tries to return it to the lamp, he ends up shocking the old and creepy armchair. While the boy is resting after another day of studying, John wakes up to the chimes of the clock and, very worried, goes to talk to Florence, who says that there have only been 3 chimes this time, and that they are getting fewer every day. Without suspecting anything is going on, Lewis wakes up early in the morning and goes to school where he finds out that Tarby has won the election for class representative. Excited, Lewis goes to congratulate his friend and ends up being interrupted by a bully who starts making fun of the fact that he lives in a haunted house. After the boy leaves, Lewis tells Tarby that everyone is wrong and that his house isn't haunted but magical, as well as revealing that his uncle is a wizard. Wanting to impress his friend, Lewis says he's training to become one too and claims he can teach him an incantation to make sure he never misses a shot, which ends up attracting Tarby's attention. Unaware that his nephew has just broken the secrecy statute in magic, John continues looking for the watch until he finds a painting of Isaac and Selena. As he looks at the image, he notices a Merlin doll with its arm raised, but for some reason it is now lowered. As soon as he lifts the doll's arm, the mouth-shaped fireplace behind him opens and John has access to a part of the house he has never explored before, including an alchemy room with several of Isaac's plans on parchment. While his uncle explores the place, Lewis comes home with his friend and starts looking for an enchantment that will be useful for baseball. After a while, Tarby notices the locked cupboard and becomes very interested in finding out what's inside, especially after discovering that John has forbidden his nephew to go in there. Rummaging through the drawers of the cupboard, Tarby finds the key and unlocks the padlock, gaining access to an ancient book of necromancy, a type of forbidden magic capable of communicating with the unliving and bringing them back to life. Finding this most interesting, Tarby begins to read the book until Lewis notices his uncle returning and takes the object from his friend's hand, locking it back in the cupboard. Angrily, Tarby says that's why Lewis has no friends and leaves, leaving the boy alone to explain himself to his uncle. Even though he feels guilty, Lewis prefers not to tell him that he took the book and asks to spend some time with him, but John is more interested in Isaac's plans and says not now, locking himself in his office to study the parchments with Florence. After some time analyzing, the woman notices several symbols of the letter Omega and remembers that this is the last letter of the Greek alphabet and that, in the Bible, it means the end of times. While they try to decipher the message, Lewis is sitting on his bed reading the dictionary when his mother reappears in front of him to talk. Realizing that her son is sad, the woman tells him that he can resolve the situation with Tarby by showing him some real magic, recommending that the boy use the book of necromancy to impress him, which will supposedly make him the most popular boy in school. Suspicious, the boy recalls that his uncle forbade him to touch the book and his mother replies that he won't even know, saying that Lewis can solve everything if he shows Tarby one of the charms. Tempted to disobey his uncle, Lewis goes to school where he watches his classmates while thinking about what to do. From afar, a girl called Rose tells him that he shouldn't care and that every year Tarby does this. He acts like a good guy until election time, and after he manages to become the representative, he goes back to acting like a lunatic. To help him get over it, Rose tells him that Lewis doesn't need him and that they can play together if he want, but the boy just ignores her and goes to Tarby to talk, saying that he'll raise an unliving man to prove he's telling the truth. To do this, Lewis takes the hidden book and breaks into the cemetery with Tarby. While looking at the tombstones for someone to resurrect, Lewis notices that the book starts to point in one direction and decides to follow it, arriving at an isolated tomb. After drawing a pentagram with the stones, Lewis cuts his own finger and uses the blood to perform the incantation, causing the tomb to open and something to come out. Desperate, the two of them run off and Lewis goes straight to the cupboard where he keeps the book, trying to pretend that nothing has happened. The next morning, John wakes up and goes to the toy room where all the dolls are happily celebrating the return of their creator. Apprehensive, John goes to the cemetery and finds the grave open, and is frightened to discover that someone has revived Isaac. At a loss for what to do, the man turns to Florence and together they decide to protect the house, nailing horseshoes to the entrance to protect them from evil. While carrying more boxes of horseshoes to the entrance, John looks up at the stained glass window and sees a drawing of him and his family in graves, which makes him fear that it is an omen. Just then, Louis appears and asks to talk, but his uncle says he doesn't have time for that and that he needs him to stay with Florence until it's safe. Back at the woman's house, Louis sees a poster of his uncle's magic shows and discovers that he used to perform with Isaac. Florence then says that they were best friends and that they did everything together, including living in the same house. After years of working side by side, Isaac had to separate from John to fight in the Second World War, until he disappeared during a mission in Germany. After several months, Isaac reappeared as if nothing had happened, but acting in a totally different way from before, and much more powerful. When asked what happened, Isaac replies that he got lost in the Black Forest, a place known for having frightening creatures that gave rise to the tales of the Brothers Grimm. Florence's theory is that Isaac met a dark sorcerer in the forest, studying terrible magics such as necromancy, which John keeps locked in the cupboard to this day. After a while, Isaac decided to stop working with John and met Selina, whom he married and lived with until they both performed a magic ritual so powerful that it ended up taking their lives. With the ritual completed, a watch key made from Selina's bones appeared in the center of the table and was soon found by Florence and John, who have been searching for the lock ever since. After hearing the whole story, Louis goes to talk to Tarby and tries to tell him who they have revived, but the boy refuses to listen, saying that nothing has happened and hitting his colleague in the stomach. Returning home, Louis begins to read Isaac's project until he notices a crow watching him. Suddenly, the books start to fall off the bookshelf and start flying around, attacking the boy until John and Florence show up to save him. Now safe, Louis says he can read the information on the parchment and helps the adults decipher the message, discovering that Isaac's clock is capable of turning time backwards, making everyone younger and younger until the entire human race ceases to exist. Reading the information, Louis discovers that the clock will be activated on the night of a lunar eclipse, which coincidentally happens to be that night. Which explains why the chimes of the clock get shorter every night. After making these discoveries, the trio return home where they realize that Isaac has destroyed all the pumpkins and burned the horseshoes that were protecting the place, signaling that he has returned even more powerful than before. Once inside, they find the house all overturned and suspect that Isaac is looking for the key. To prevent this from happening, they have the idea of destroying the object, but even with the strongest mixtures, the key doesn't melt at all. While they're stirring the pot, Louis finally gets up the courage to tell the truth and says that it was he who brought Isaac back, which makes his uncle furious. After a heated discussion, John and Florence go to the library where they talk about what they should do. Meanwhile, Louis starts looking around the neighborhood until he sees Isaac at Mrs. Hanchett's window. Desperate, the boy runs to the woman's house and helps her out, taking her into John's mansion. Wanting help, the boy calls for his uncle who even tries to go to him, but something has locked the library door and there's nothing he can do. At that moment, something starts calling from outside and Louis tries to ask Mrs. Hanchett to leave, but the woman doesn't listen and opens the door, allowing Isaac to enter the house. Finally inside, the zombie wizard greets Louis and starts kissing Mrs. Hanchett, who is actually Selina. Seeing the woman in front of him, Louis says she was supposed to be perished and the woman replies that, on the day of the ritual, Isaac used the bone of the real Mrs. Hanchett to make the key. After the explosion that eliminated her lover, Selina took her neighbor's place and started living next to the mansion, just waiting for her lover to return. When Louis appeared, Selina began to assume the form of his mother and invade his dreams to convince him to take the Book of Necromancy, because the cabinet had strong protections that prevented her from getting close. While the two of them thank him for his help, Florence and John finally manage to leave the library and start looking for the boy throughout the house, but they end up falling into Isaac's trap. Chained and bound in a straitjacket, the two wizards can do nothing while Isaac locks Louis in a cage and threatens to release him on steel stakes. Desperate, John says that his friend wasn't like that and asks what happened to him during the war. Discovering that after his platoon was defeated by German soldiers, Isaac began to wander through the dark forest until he met Azazel, a demon who saved him and implanted the blueprint for the clock inside his mind. After telling the story, Isaac begins to pull the key with magic until Florence finally decides to react, tearing the straitjacket and casting a spell that sends Selina flying. Angrily, the woman asks her rat to gnaw on the rope and Louis' cage narrowly misses the spikes, but Florence manages to make the object levitate and leaves the boy safely on the ground. Meanwhile, John tries to get the key back and ends up being blinded by Isaac, who steals the object and disappears without them seeing. After freeing Louis, the three come out of hiding and end up surrounded by Isaac's bizarre dolls. Outnumbered, the troupe of hooded puppets destroys Florence's wand and captures the trio, throwing them out of the house. In the garden, the three begin to be attacked by a gang of mutant pumpkins who bind their feet with a gooey lick. About to be devoured, Louis sees that one of the pumpkins has an axe stuck in its head and grabs it to defend himself, smashing some of them and cutting the goo off its feet. Finally free, the three run into the street where one of the pumpkins pulls John's foot, causing him to fall on his head and pass out. After arriving home, Florence wakes up her friend and prepares another wand for the fight. With 18 minutes to go until the eclipse, they start to think of a way to get to the clock, and Louis comes up with the idea of looking for it on his own, as he's not a wizard and so the protection won't work on him. With the plan in place, the trio return to the manor and Florence blows up all the pumpkins with her wand. As John tries to unlock the door, a chimera made out of a bush advances towards them and the trio are very nearly devoured by the creature. Once inside the house, they are greeted by bizarre dolls and Florence manages to erase them all with a purple mist, leaving the way clear for them to move on to the next room. Looking for the clock, the trio go down to the basement where they find a secret passage under the boiler. But when it's her turn to go down, Florence is captured by a giant octopus that prevents her from continuing her journey. Alone, uncle and nephew walk towards the clock until they see Selena and Isaac putting the key in the lock and unlocking the mechanism. John tries to throw a fireball to stop them, but the couple are protected by a barrier that knocks the projectile back, causing uncle and nephew to be hit. After turning the key, Isaac moves forward as the ground begins to give way, revealing the immense gears beneath the floor. Racing against time, John goes to the clock and tries to use a copy of the key to deactivate the mechanism, but ends up failing and is hit by the clock's magic, which turns him back into a baby with an adult face, something totally bizarre. While Louis is trying to help him, Isaac appears and says he likes the boy, asking him to accompany him to the tower, which will protect them from the effects of the clock. Taking advantage of the distraction, Uncle John gets into the middle of the gears and starts crawling, forcing the boy to go after him to save him. Suddenly, a giant gear starts coming towards him to crush him and Louis has the idea of throwing the toy he received from his parents, which ends up locking the clock mechanism. In order for the plan to go ahead, Isaac and Selena activate the lever that gives the gears an energy boost, but down below, Louis manages to manipulate the electricity and throws it back in their direction, sending them back in time until they disappear. As a result, the clock mechanism stops working and John reverts to his adult self. Outside the boiler, uncle and nephew find Florence well and the three of them celebrate together. After everything calms down, Louis returns to school where he is rejected by Tarby and the other bully in basketball class, but now he doesn't care anymore and decides to become friends with Rose, as well as furthering his knowledge as a new wizard. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.